We all think we know how conquest ends. Flames licking the rafters, barrels split open, laughter rolling like surf. The camera always cuts after the cheer. But history doesn't end there. It opens a different account book, and on its first page is a number, small, cold, and terrible. The year is 821. A monk on the Irish coast dips his quill, not to write an epic, but to balance a loss. In the annals of Ulster, the entry is almost nothing. Howth was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. That's it. No names, no tears. Just an accounting line. But if you pry that sentence open, an entire world of violence and profit spills out. Howth was not a soft target. It was a sentinel, rock shouldering out into the sea at the mouth of Dublin Bay, a place that watched ships approach and taxed their nerve. Taking women there was not impulse or indulgence. It was procurement. In the 9th century, people were the highest yield asset you could steal, portable, divisible, and self-replicating. And among people, women were premium stock. They worked, they wove. They healed. They carried languages and lineages in their mouths and wombs. They made future laborers. They generated alliances. They were, in the merciless grammar of the age, multipliers. Once the doors were smashed and the smoke was biting, the sorting began. Not the sorting of goods, the sorting of bodies. Young, healthy, high-status women were a merchant's dream. Durable on the march, valuable on the block, capable of bearing children who'd be counted as property from the first breath. Old injuries were liabilities. Visible skills, fine needlework, fluent speech in Latin or Gaelic were features. None of this language belongs to human dignity. All of it belongs to the ledger. The journey began on planks black with tar and salt. Longships were not made for comfort. They were made for speed, and speed doesn't care if you can sleep. Captives lay where cargo fit, between oarsmen's backs and the sea's teeth. In bad weather, the spray took the warmth out of lungs. In worse weather, the ocean asked for bodies back. Voyage mortality wasn't an accident. It was a filter. The weak, the sick, the grief-broken were subtracted in transit. The rest arrived as survivors, or, more precisely, as inventory that had passed an unannounced inspection. The destination was Dyflin, the Viking settlement that would grow into Dublin. It did not yet have the stone face of a later city. It had mud and timber, piles of traded goods, the tang of fish and iron, and a market that dealt in the most liquid commodity in the North Atlantic: people. There on the strand, the human calculus became public. Teeth were checked, joints flexed, hair examined for disease. The same motions a farmer used to judge a heifer's vigor were turned, without irony, on human beings. A healthy young woman fetched 12 to 20 ounces of silver. Think about that through a farmer's eyes. A year of a small holding surplus, gone in one purchase. Think about it through a kingdom's eyes. 100 such women moved across a single season's horizon. Silver consolidated. Labor relocated, lineages rewritten. But Dublin was only a hinge in a larger door. Some women were kept for Norse households growing like palisades along the Irish coast. Others were shipped north and east, fitted into trade chains as neatly as iron bars and amber, strings. Hedeby, Birka, the Rus rivers drawing longships, like needles through the fabric of the continent toward black-haired. Merchants in the markets of Constantinople and the Abbasid courts in Baghdad. The routes were not myths. They were arteries, and through them pulsed furs, walrus ivory, weapons, and women. Skills didn't disappear in captivity. They were repriced. The woman who had laid out a king's household cloth now wove sailcloth that would not tear in a gale, and the thread count of her work added ounces to her value. The girl who had learned a charm for turning a breech birth did the same under a different roof, her hands saving new lives that would be born into someone else's surname. Literate eyes recited prayers in Latin to children who would never know the church their mother had left behind. The market rewarded such features. Imagine hearing your worth argued over in terms that sounded like a product sheet. The annal doesn't tell us what we most want, a single name. That omission is not a failure of record-keeping. It is the point of the system. Anonymity is the final stage of theft. Steal the body, then the home, then the lineage, then the language, and the personhood collapses into the blank space where a name would have been. The ease with which later centuries told romance about captors recognizing kindred spirits is not accidental either. The fantasy is a solvent we pour on facts too rough to touch. It makes property sound like courtship. It makes a market sound like destiny, but the numbers refuse to dissolve. 12 ounces. 18 ounces, 20. Enough silver to weight a merchant's hand. Enough to rebuild a burnt hull front to back. Enough to decide whether a raiding party would risk the coast again next season, pulled by the same fat margins that pull any trader back to a profitable port. The difference between a raid and a business trip is a matter of inventory. Think, too, about what doesn't make it onto the line of the ledger. The lost songs, the unspoken oaths, the skills that never get taught to daughters because the daughters are taught new names instead. A culture is not a flag. It's a million tiny motions of the hand and the mouth, how you fold bread, how you braid hair, the proverb that slips out when rain hits hard. When women move under compulsion, those motions move too. They graft onto new households where they root or they wither. Either way, the tree that grows does not look like the old one. That's not an accident of the Viking Age. It's its design. So begin here, where the monk's line item sits like a dulled knife. Not with bonfires. Not with horns raised against a sky already forgetting the names of the dead. Begin with a number, because inside that number are legs on a plank floor taking the weight of sea miles. Hands holding another woman's hand in the dark in a language both will be beaten for speaking. Eyes that have watched a shoreline they will never touch again sink behind a stern shaped like a dragon's jaw. And understand this, the market did not misfire. It performed as intended. The women were not collateral damage. They were cargo. They were profit. We will, in the next breaths, give back what the ledger took. Names when we can, stories when we can't, fates that the sagas and the soil have held for us. But we will not pretend the accounting wasn't clever. It was ruthless and it was efficient, and it trained generations to look past the human being to the silver she could be turned into. The great lie is that war ends when the torches go out. The truth is that the balance sheet opens when the fire burns low, and it begins with the bodies that can be moved. History occasionally fumbles and leaves us a name. Most of the women taken in raids remain faceless in the sources, entries in monastic ledgers or price tags in a market. But every so often, a saga rescues one. A single ember that glows centuries after the fire. Her name was Melkorka, daughter of an Irish king, sold across the sea. Her story is the paradox of captivity. A life erased yet remembered, because her silence made more noise than words. It begins in violence, sudden and total. Around the year 956, the hall of her father, King Melkorka of Ireland, broke open under the storm of Norsemen. The saga is sparse on detail, but we know how these moments went. The world of kinship, security, and status collapses not in days, but in the span of a raid, hours of shouting, burning, breaking. She went from a princess with alliances mapped for her future to cargo packed into a ship. Her identity stripped the moment her wrists were bound. The sagas never soften this transition. It isn't a decline. It's a plunge, a free fall from sovereignty to property. Norway's coasts were crowded markets. Timber, furs, iron, walrus ivory, and people. The rust trader who held Melkorka likely trafficked dozens of captives, each tagged by their age, health, and bearing. To the merchant, she wasn't a daughter of a king. She was prime stock. To the man who purchased her, she was something rarer. A luxury item. That buyer was Höskuldur Dalakolsson, an Icelandic chieftain of power and wealth, operating under license from the King of Norway himself. He saw Melkorka displayed in the marketplace and made a calculation. Not only was she beautiful, but something in her posture, the way her back refused to bend fully, the steadiness of her gaze, hinted at high birth. Even stripped of clothing, she carried traces of royalty like invisible regalia. Höskuldur knew the market. He knew value. He paid 3 marks of silver for her. That was not a bargain price. It was extravagant. 24 ounces of pure silver, 3 times the cost of a prime milk cow. The kind of investment you make not for utility, but for prestige. Owning her would display his wealth as clearly as wearing a necklace of gold, and so she entered his household in Iceland. Not as a wife, not as a servant, as a concubine, a frilla. That status was not affection. It was a rung in the hierarchy, higher than a field slave, lower than a lawful spouse. She was pleasure, ornament, and proof of her owner's reach into distant markets. In the sagas, her existence is noted but barely remarked upon, as if her degradation was a matter of course. And yet, here the silence begins. For years after her arrival, Melkorka said nothing. Not a whisper in the household, not a single word. The men of Höskuldur's circle assumed trauma had broken her voice, that the violence of her capture had stolen her speech forever. But her muteness was not damage. It was defiance. In a world where her body, Her time, her children, and even her survival belonged to another man. Her voice was the one possession she could deny. By withholding it, she made herself unknowable, unmarketable. She refused to be fully absorbed into the role carved for her. Silence became armor. She bore Höskuldur a son, Olaf. To everyone, even to Höskuldur himself, she remained mute. She fulfilled the role assigned, beautiful, compliant, silent, and in that compliance hid her rebellion. Years passed, and then one day the mask cracked. Höskuldur was walking near a stream on his farm. Over the sound of water, he heard a woman's voice, clear, gentle, foreign. He followed and discovered Melkorka speaking to young Olaf. But she was not speaking Norse. She was speaking Gaelic, the language of her birth, the language forbidden her in Iceland, the language that had carried her lineage and her father's kingship. She was not simply speaking. She was teaching. She told Olaf who he was, the grandson of a king. She gave him back a heritage that captivity had tried to erase. The shock for Höskuldur must have been seismic. The expensive ornament he had purchased revealed herself as a princess, a woman of standing equal to his own. The household's assumption that she was mute, broken, diminished, collapsed in an instant. Höskuldur confronted her, and the truth spilled out. Her silence had not been a symptom. It had been a strategy. For years, she had hoarded her words, waiting until her son was old enough to receive them, to understand, to carry them forward. In that hidden classroom by the stream, she detonated the fiction of her anonymity. Her revelation shifted her standing in the household, but only slightly. She was treated with more respect. Her bearing was recognized as royal, but she was never freed. She never became Höskuldur's wife. Her strategy had preserved a fragment of self, but the system remained intact. She was still property. She was still a concubine. Her one true victory was that she had smuggled her lineage forward into her son. Olaf grew. He became Olaf the Peacock, a chieftain known for his splendor, his fine clothes, his charisma. He traveled to Ireland, met his grandfather Melkorka, and was acknowledged as part of the royal line. He reclaimed what his mother had whispered to him in secret. He stitched the two halves of his identity together, Norse power, Gaelic heritage. His future was gilded, but Melkorka's wasn't. She died in Iceland, never free, never returned, her own home forever distant. She carved out survival in silence, gave her son his birthright in a forbidden tongue, and then vanished into the soil of a foreign island. What does her story tell us? That resistance isn't always a sword stroke or a blaze of martyrdom. Sometimes it's years of silence, a refusal to let go of the one fragment of power left. Sometimes rebellion is choosing when and to whom you speak. In the cold arithmetic of the slave market, where names are erased and identities reduced to prices, Melkorka's silence was a delayed detonation. Her voice reemerged not for her captor, not for her owner, but for her child. And in that act, she sabotaged the system's intent. She taught her son that he was not just property's son, but a king's grandson. The sagas remembered her not because she submitted, but because she resisted in the only way captivity left open. She endured as property, but her silence preserved her royalty. That is why her name survived when so many others were erased. When armies march, the walls they breach are only half the story. The other half waits behind those walls. Communities, families, the vulnerable who will never lift a blade. To the Viking warbands of the 9th century, monasteries were ripe fruit. They held gold, food, relics, but they also held women. And in a world where people were profit, those women were not spared. They were targeted. Yet at Coldingham in the year 870, the women did something extraordinary. They weaponized the only thing they had left, their own bodies. The monastery at Coldingham stood on a wind-scoured cliff in Northumbria, a kingdom straddling what is now northern England and southeastern Scotland. It was not a small place of prayer. It was a double monastery, a community of monks and nuns under one rule, a center of faith and learning. To the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, the leaders of the great heathen army, it was nothing more than a strongbox waiting to be split open. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and their warriors had spent 5 brutal years cutting across England. When they turned north, Coldingham was just another mark on their map. Silver, food, captives. The abbess, Ebba the Younger, was no naive recluse. She knew the stories. Word traveled fast along the coast, carried by survivors or by the smoke of ruined sanctuaries. She had heard what happened when raiders poured into monasteries, relics stolen, monks murdered, women violated. For her sisters, the horror was not only physical, it was spiritual. To a nun who had given her life to God, sexual violation was more than a wound. It was a desecration, a corruption that threatened the soul itself. The Vikings understood that, even if they did not share the belief. Rape was not an accident of war. It was a weapon. It broke communities more completely than fire. As the sound of war horns drifted up from the shoreline, Ebba gathered her nuns in the chapter house, the stone heart of the monastery. Imagine that room. Fear thick as smoke, the faces of women who had given up families to serve Christ, staring now at the certainty of ruin. There was no rescue coming, no army on the march to protect them. They had only themselves and one terrible choice: submit or resist. Ebba did not pray for deliverance. She acted. Taking a blade, she stood before her sisters and in one deliberate motion sliced away her nose and upper lip. Blood poured, her face mangled, transformed into a mask of horror. Then she spoke, her voice recorded centuries later by chroniclers. Make yourselves a spectacle of horror to the lust of the barbarians. One by one, the women followed. Each nun raised the blade to her own face. Each woman disfigured herself, not out of despair, but as an act of control. If the invaders sought beauty to plunder, the nuns destroyed it. If the raiders sought bodies to violate, the nuns turned those bodies into weapons of revulsion. It was the most desperate kind of agency, but agency nonetheless. In a world where everything else would be taken from them, they seized the one thing still within their power, their own flesh. When the Vikings burst into the chapter house, their expectations collided with nightmare. They had stormed monasteries before, met terror and pleading, women clutching at crucifixes in vain. At Coldingham, they were met by silent ranks of mutilated faces, blood streaming, eyes staring back with defiance. Whatever the invaders felt, shock, rage, disgust, it was not satisfaction. Their prize had been ruined. Their power had been denied. Denial bred fury. The raiders dragged timber and furniture against the chapter house, barred the doors, and set the building ablaze. Fire roared through the chamber, consuming wooden beams, tapestries, and the women themselves. The abbess and her nuns burned alive. Their choice was not between life and death. Death was inevitable. Their choice was between two deaths, one at the hands of their violators, or one in the purifying fire of their own making. Chroniclers remembered them as martyrs. Some later writers doubted the story, thought it too extreme, too grotesque to be true. But its persistence matters. Whether or not every detail is literal, the tale crystallizes the truth of that moment in history. Women understood the stakes. They knew their bodies were a battlefield, and they chose how that battle would end. It's tempting to romanticize their defiance, to make of it a tidy legend of resistance. But sit with the brutality of it. Women tearing away their own faces because that was the only way to protect their souls. It is not triumph in the traditional sense. It is triumph in a narrower, darker frame. The triumph of refusing to be what the enemy demanded. And here's the deeper horror. Their defiance didn't save them. It didn't save the monastery. It didn't stop the great heathen army. Northumbria still fell under the Viking tide. But in that room, for those hours, the women reclaimed themselves. Their story forces us to reckon with a different dimension of war, one where the decisive act of resistance is not on the battlefield, but in the private, bloody decisions of those marked as prizes. Coldingham is a brutal reminder that resistance is not always victorious. Sometimes resistance is about shaping the manner of your defeat. Sometimes it is about saying, in the final instant, you may take my life, but you will not take me in the way you planned. That is what Ebba and her sisters achieved. Burned, buried, but unbroken in the only way left to them. When armies march, the walls they breach are only half the story. The other half waits behind those walls. Communities, families, the vulnerable who will never lift a blade. To the Viking warbands of the 9th century, monasteries were ripe fruit. They held gold, food, relics, but they also held women. And in a world where people were profit, those women were not spared. They were targeted. Yet at Coldingham in the year 870, the women did something extraordinary. They weaponized the only thing they had left, their own bodies. The monastery at Coldingham stood on a wind-scoured cliff in Northumbria, a kingdom straddling what is now northern England and southeastern Scotland. It was not a small place of prayer. It was a double monastery, a community of monks and nuns under one rule, a center of faith and learning. To the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, the leaders of the great heathen army, it was nothing more than a strongbox waiting to be split open. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and their warriors had spent 5 brutal years cutting across England. When they turned north, Coldingham was just another mark on their map: silver, food, captives. The abbess, Ebba the Younger, was no naive recluse. She knew the stories. Word traveled fast along the coast, carried by survivors or by the smoke of ruined sanctuaries. She had heard what happened when raiders poured into monasteries, relics stolen, monks murdered, women violated. For her sisters, the horror was not only physical, it was spiritual. To a nun who had given her life to God, sexual violation was more than a wound. It was a desecration, a corruption that threatened the soul itself. The Vikings understood that, even if they did not share the belief. Rape was not an accident of war. It was a weapon. It broke communities more completely than fire. As the sound of war horns drifted up from the shoreline, Ebba gathered her nuns in the chapter house, the stone heart of the monastery. Imagine that room. Fear thick as smoke, the faces of women who had given up families to serve Christ, staring now at the certainty of ruin. There was no rescue coming, no army on the march to protect them. They had only themselves and one terrible choice: submit or resist. Ebba did not pray for deliverance. She acted. Taking a blade, she stood before her sisters and in one deliberate motion sliced away her nose and upper lip. Blood poured, her face mangled, transformed into a mask of horror. Then she spoke, her voice recorded centuries later by chroniclers. Make yourselves a spectacle of horror to the lust of the barbarians. One by one, the women followed. Each nun raised the blade to her own face. Each woman disfigured herself, not out of despair, but as an act of control. If the invaders sought beauty to plunder, the nuns destroyed it. If the raiders sought bodies to violate, the nuns turned those bodies into weapons of revulsion. It was the most desperate kind of agency, but agency nonetheless. In a world where everything else would be taken from them, they seized the one thing still within their power: their own flesh. When the Vikings burst into the chapter house, their expectations collided with nightmare. They had stormed monasteries before, met terror and pleading, women clutching at crucifixes in vain. At Coldingham, they were met by silent ranks of mutilated faces, blood streaming, eyes staring back with defiance. Whatever the invaders felt, shock, rage, disgust, it was not satisfaction. Their prize had been ruined. Their power had been denied. Denial bred fury. The raiders dragged timber and furniture against the chapter house, barred the doors, and set the building ablaze. Fire roared through the chamber, consuming wooden beams, tapestries, and the women themselves. The abbess and her nuns burned alive. Their choice was not between life and death. Death was inevitable. Their choice was between 2 deaths, one at the hands of their violators, or one in the purifying fire of their own making. Chroniclers remembered them as martyrs. Some later writers doubted the story, thought it too extreme, too grotesque to be true. But its persistence matters. Whether or not every detail is literal, the tale crystallizes the truth of that moment in history. Women understood the stakes. They knew their bodies were a battlefield, and they chose how that battle would end. It's tempting to romanticize their defiance, to make of it a tidy legend of resistance. But sit with the brutality of it. Women tearing away their own faces because that was the only way to protect their souls. It is not triumph in the traditional sense. It is triumph in a narrower, darker frame. The triumph of refusing to be what the enemy demanded. And here's the deeper horror. Their defiance didn't save them. It didn't save the monastery. It didn't stop the great heathen army. Northumbria still fell under the Viking tide. But in that room, for those hours, the women reclaimed themselves. Their story forces us to reckon with a different dimension of war, one where the decisive act of resistance is not on the battlefield, but in the private, bloody decisions of those marked as prizes. Coldingham is a brutal reminder that resistance is not always victorious. Sometimes resistance is about shaping the manner of your defeat. Sometimes it is about saying, in the final instant, you may take my life, but you will not take me in the way you planned. That is what Ebba and her sisters achieved. Burned, buried, but unbroken in the only way left to them. A wall can stop swords. A cliff can stop ladders. But thirst stops everything. At Dumbarton Rock in 870, the great fortress of the Britons did not fall to fire or assault. It fell because the well ran dry. And when it fell, it fed one of the largest human trafficking operations of the Viking Age. Dumbarton was no ordinary stronghold. Known then as Alt Clut, the Rock of the Clyde, it was the capital of the kingdom of Strathclyde. Picture it, a volcanic plug rising sheer from the banks of the River Clyde, cliffs too steep to climb, walls crowned with timber and stone, the river itself as a moat. For centuries it had stood as a symbol of defiance, the heart of a people whose sovereignty was carved into the rock itself. In 870, two Viking leaders joined forces against it, Olaf the White, Norse king of Dublin, and Ivar the Boneless, already infamous for campaigns across England. Their armies moved with precision. They knew this fortress could not be stormed head-on. So they laid siege. For 4 months they ringed the rock with steel and fire. Nothing in, nothing out. Inside the fortress, the Britons endured. Food stores dwindled but could be stretched. Weapons could be repaired. But one thing could not be replaced: water. The besiegers knew it. They cut off the springs. They strangled the fortress not with fire, but with thirst. After 120 days, the well was dry. The defenders had fought swords with swords and walls with courage. But no one fights thirst. They surrendered, and that is when the true business began. This was not a chaotic plundering. It was an organized operation. Olaf and Ivar did not raid and run. They stayed. Through the winter, they consolidated their gains. Captives were gathered, sorted, guarded. Wealth was inventoried. The Rock of the Clyde had not just fallen. It had been harvested. When spring came, the annals record what must have been a terrible sight: a fleet of 200 longships sailing out of the Clyde, their holds packed. Not just with treasure, though there was treasure, but with people. The Chronicle describes it coldly. They brought away a great booty of Angles, Britons, and Picts. A great booty. Human beings listed alongside livestock and metal. Among them was the king himself, Arthgal, ruler of Strathclyde. Alongside him, his queen, his daughters, his entire court. In a single season, the royal household was reduced to cargo. The king's fate was grim. Taken to Dublin, he was later executed on Olaf's orders, eliminating any chance of Strathclyde rallying under him. For his wife and daughters, survival meant something different: the slave markets. Imagine the Queen of Strathclyde, who had presided over a court, arranged alliances, directed household affairs. Now her wrists bound, her lineage stripped away, her body priced in ounces of silver. Royal birth, once a shield, was now a feature on a sales sheet, an exotic rarity that could drive up her value. Her daughters, once destined to forge political bonds through marriage, became commodities in an entirely different economy. The scale of this seizure staggers the imagination. 200 ships, each carrying scores of captives, hundreds, perhaps thousands of men, women, and children ripped from their homes and pressed into a market system that spanned continents. This was not incidental enslavement. This was the business model. The siege was the investment. The thirst was the weapon. The ships were the transport. And the women were the profit. Where did they go? Some remained in Ireland, absorbed into Norse households around Dublin, the city that was rapidly becoming one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Others were sold further afield. Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, down the Rus rivers to Novgorod and Kiev. From there, some may have traveled to the Byzantine Empire, where eunuchs and concubines were bought for gold, or even as far as the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, where demand for human labor and companionship was insatiable. Each step of that journey stripped away more of their identity. A princess of Strathclyde might become an ornament in a Scandinavian chieftain's hall. A noblewoman might be repurposed as a nurse, a weaver, or a concubine thousands of miles from her homeland. What united them all was the fact that their lives had been recalculated into profit margins. And for Strathclyde itself, the fall of Dumbarton was more than the loss of a fortress. It was the gutting of a kingdom, with its king dead, its court enslaved, and its noble women scattered across foreign lands, its lineages shattered. Strathclyde was left politically broken. The siege was not just a military victory. It was demographic warfare. By uprooting the very women who carried its future, Olaf and Ivar ensured the kingdom's decline. We like to imagine medieval warfare as raids of passion, hot-blooded violence followed by retreat. Dumbarton exposes the colder reality. This was systematic, deliberate, long-term. a campaign measured not in loot gathered on a single night, but in human lives funneled into a machine that converted kingdoms into currency. Picture it, the spring thaw, the longships pushing out from the Clyde, their dragon heads cutting through the water, their decks heavy with the weight of captives. The Britons looked down from their fortress at the river that had once protected them, now carrying their families away forever. The silence of that shoreline would have been louder than any battle cry. The annals call it simply a great booty of people. But behind that line are queens stripped of crowns, daughters turned into concubines, mothers separated from children, households erased. Behind that line is the truth that in the Viking Age, the fall of a fortress was not measured in broken walls, but in bodies shipped across seas. When the sagas tell of Iceland's settlement, they sound like epics of freedom. Rugged Norsemen sailing west to escape kings and find new land. They speak of explorers, of pioneers, of men carving farms from volcanic rock with only courage and iron. But if you read carefully, if you look between the lines, you see another story. A darker one. Iceland was not built only on the strength of Norse settlers. It was built on the bodies of women taken from across the sea. The primary source for this period is the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements. On its surface, it is a proud genealogy. Who came first, what land they claimed, which sons inherited it. It is a national origin story dressed in the clothing of memory and pride, but buried in its dry lines are cold facts that shatter the heroic myth. Time and again, the record notes that before settling in Iceland, these men raided Ireland and Scotland. They brought back captives. They brought back women. Take Ingemund the Old, one of the most respected settlers. Before he claimed land in Iceland, the text notes that his men raided Ireland. They did not return empty-handed. They brought captives, human beings folded into the supplies needed to start new lives. The book does not call this cruelty. It records it with no judgment, as if it were as ordinary as packing seed grain, or consider Kettle the foolish. The record praises him for his Christianity, noting that no heathens would live on his land. He is presented as an outlier, a man of unusual faith. But trace the family lines of his descendants, and you find that their wives, the matriarchs of their households, were often explicitly identified as Irish women, captives taken in raids. His Christian settlement was not a break from violence. It was interwoven with it. And then there is Refgerd, an Irish noblewoman taken by a man named Ivan the Easterner. She is recorded in the Landnámabók as his wife in Iceland. But she did not choose that marriage. She was forced, transplanted from the green hills of Ireland to a barren lava field at the edge of the known world. In the record, she is not presented as a victim. She is presented as part of a lineage, the mother of so-and-so, the grandmother of so-and-so. Her trauma is erased, repurposed into the pride of Icelandic genealogy. This pattern is not a handful of exceptions. It is the foundation. And today, modern science has confirmed what the sagas only hint at. Genetic studies of the Icelandic population reveal a stark split. The Y chromosomes, the paternal lines, are overwhelmingly Norse, tracing back to Norway and Scandinavia. But the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal lines, tell a different story. Up to 63% of the original women who founded Iceland had ancestry from Ireland and Scotland. Think about that number. More than half. The math is brutal. It means that for nearly every proud patriarch listed in the Landnámabók, there was a woman who had been taken, a woman who had not chosen to board that ship, a woman whose voice, whose songs, whose memories of home were dragged into a new land and smothered beneath a foreign tongue. And yet, those voices did not disappear completely. They were carried in lullabies sung to children, in the quiet repetition of prayers whispered in Gaelic long after the household spoke only Norse. They were carried in skills, textile patterns, herbs used for medicine, ways of telling stories. The sagas we read in Icelandic halls centuries later may have been told in Norse words, but beneath them, ghosts of Irish and Scottish mothers were still present. We are used to imagining colonization as conquest of land. In Iceland, it was also conquest of lineage. Women were not only companions in the new settlement, they were the reproductive engine of the nation. Their bodies were the soil from which new generations grew. Every child born in those early farmsteads was a living testament to coercion, half Norse father, half unwilling Gaelic mother. The Landnámabók never lingers on their suffering. It lists their names, when it lists them at all, as footnotes in genealogies. Taken from Ireland, a captive from the Hebrides, words that compress lives of trauma into 3 or 4 syllables. Yet in those terse notes we glimpse the reality. The settlers did not find a new nation in empty land. They manufactured one out of violence, out of abduction, out of forced motherhood, and the genetic record refuses to let us forget. Mitochondrial DNA is passed only from mothers to children. It is a perfect recorder of maternal ancestry. And in Iceland, it speaks louder than the sagas. It says this nation was built by women who were not Norse. It says their wombs were the true foundations of Iceland's society. Think of one of those women, standing on a shore she had never seen before, the black lava stretching under a sky streaked with cold light. She had been stolen from a hall in Ireland, shoved into a ship, and dragged across seas to this edge of the world. Now she was told she was wife to a man who had murdered her kinsman. She was told she would farm, weave, bear children, and she did. Her children grew, called themselves Icelanders, spoke Norse, and told sagas about their father's courage. Her name was lost, but her blood remained. Her mitochondrial DNA was carried forward, generation after generation, until scientists uncovered it centuries later and said, this is where Iceland's mothers came from. Iceland's story, when told honestly, is not only about rugged explorers, it is about stolen women. Their grief is not recorded in the sagas. Their songs are not written in runes. But their bodies built the nation, their genes shaped its people, and their silence haunts its origin story. The myth is of freedom. The truth is of coercion. The men who fled the tyranny of kings in Norway created their own tyranny in Iceland, one built on the abduction of women whose descendants would one day call themselves free. In 1904, farmers digging into a burial mound near the Oslofjord uncovered something astonishing. Beneath layers of earth and blue clay lay a ship, 21 meters of oak, its prow carved into a serpent's coil. It was one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the Viking Age, the Oseberg ship burial. Inside was treasure beyond imagination. Carved sledges, ornate tapestries, chests inlaid with metal, beds shaped for queens, and the sacrificed remains of horses and dogs. This was not the funeral of a mere mortal. It was the farewell of someone whose power demanded a vessel fit for kings. And in that ship lay 2 women. The first was elderly, somewhere between 70 and 80 years old. Her bones told of immense suffering late in life. Cancer gnawed her body, leaving lesions in her skeleton. Yet her burial told a different story. She was no ordinary woman. The treasures, the grandeur, the sheer scale of the ritual signaled she had been someone of staggering importance. A queen, a priestess, a matriarch whose death demanded spectacle. Beside her was a second woman. Younger, around 50. For decades, scholars assumed she was a companion, perhaps a servant, someone loyal enough to follow her mistress into the afterlife. The sagas and chronicles were silent about her. She seemed an accessory in the burial, a shadow to the main figure. But modern science has pulled her back into focus, and her story may be far darker than devotion. Her DNA was examined, specifically her mitochondrial haplogroup, the genetic signature passed from mother to child. The results startled researchers. She belonged to haplogroup U7, a lineage extraordinarily rare in Scandinavia. Its origins were thousands of miles away, in regions around the Black Sea, in modern Iran, in the lands of the East. She was not born in Norway. She had come from far away, or more likely, she had been brought. Further evidence came from isotopic analysis of her bones. Chemical traces lock in the diet of a person's early life. Hers showed a sudden shift. For much of her life, her food had matched that of her homeland, grains and vegetables from the East. But late in life, her bones recorded a high-protein marine diet, typical of Norway's elite. At some point, she had been uprooted, transplanted into a new world where fish and meat dominated the table. Taken together, the evidence paints a chilling picture. She may have been a noblewoman in her homeland, captured in a raid, traded along the great rivers by the Rus, sold north into Scandinavia, and placed in the household of the Oseberg queen. There she lived, not as a field slave, but as property nonetheless. A high-status captive repurposed as an attendant, a symbol of her mistress's wealth. And when the queen died, her fate was sealed. The burial chamber was not large enough for chance. The second woman was not there by coincidence. She was sacrificed, perhaps strangled, perhaps drugged, her body placed beside her mistress to serve in death as she had in life. The Oseberg burial is breathtaking, but it is also terrifying. The carved wood, the ornate textiles, the horses and dogs, like all of it dazzles. But at its center lies an act of possession so absolute it extended into the grave. The younger woman's life had been taken once, stolen from her homeland. It was taken again at her death, consumed as part of the ritual that exalted her owner. Think about the scale of the message that burial sent. Anyone who saw the mound, anyone who glimpsed the serpent-prowed ship rising from the earth would know. This was wealth. This was power. This was a woman who commanded lives, not only in life, but even in death. And at her side lay the evidence, silent but undeniable. Another woman, foreign, bound into the ritual as proof of ownership. Archaeology has a way of turning up contradictions. For years, the Oseberg queen was celebrated as a symbol of female power in the Viking Age, proof that women could rule, command, and be buried with honors equal to men. That much is true. But what her burial also reveals is the flip side of that power. It was built on the possession of others. Her magnificence was not solitary. It was adorned with the life of a woman taken from far away, stripped of her homeland, sacrificed to seal another's glory. In the sagas, loyalty is often celebrated, retainers who die for their lords, companions who follow leaders into the grave. But the isotopes in the second woman's bones whisper another truth. She was not a loyal companion. She was an imported captive. Her loyalty was coerced, enforced not by love but by ownership. Even in death, she was denied individuality. The treasures of the burial were not hers. The ship was not hers. The horses, the sledges, the tapestries, all belonged to the queen. She was there as ornament, as proof of dominion. Her body, the ultimate treasure sacrificed to mark another's passage to the afterlife. The Oseberg find is often displayed in museums with awe, and rightly so. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the preservation miraculous. But when we look at it, we must also see what it conceals. Behind the serpent-carved prow, behind the glitter of the grave goods, is a story of a woman brought from the Far East to die in Norway. Her life reduced to an accessory in another's display of wealth, bound, buried, forgotten. 7 stories. 7 fates. Different years, different coasts, different names. But look at them together and the pattern sharpens into focus. The Viking Age, so often framed as an age of adventure, was also an age of trafficking. Women were not incidental casualties. They were central resources. At Howth in 821, the annals tell us plainly, they carried off a great number of women, not plundered and happened to seize, not raided and happened to take, carried off, deliberately, systematically. Melkorka, the mute princess sold in Norway, shows the same logic at work. Beauty, status, lineage turned into currency. At Coldingham, the terror was not of swords, but of what came after swords and systematic rape as weapon and profit. At Canterbury, women of status were kept alive because they were valuable, bargaining chips in ransom negotiations. At Dumbarton, an entire fortress was reduced not to rubble, but to human cargo packed into ships. In Iceland, the very population of a new nation was engineered by seizing women from Ireland and Scotland. And at Oseberg, the sacrifice of a foreign woman became the ornament of a queen's grave. Different stories. One logic, the logic was economic. Silver was the lifeblood of the Viking Age. It funded armies, paid for ships, bought loyalty. And human beings, and especially women, were silver in another form. A young noblewoman could fetch 12 to 20 ounces of pure silver on the Dublin market, the equivalent of an entire farmstead's yearly output. The sagas don't always say it out loud, but every raid, every siege, every campaign carried this hidden motive, to capture not just gold and goods, but women who could be resold, repurposed, reclassified. The markets were vast. Dublin was a hub, described by contemporaries as one of the largest slave ports in Western Europe. Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden hummed with commerce. Down the great rivers, the Rus trafficked captives east to Constantinople and Baghdad. There, demand was endless. Eunuchs, concubines, domestic slaves, each had a price, each had a buyer. Viking warfare was not just about local plunder. It was plugged into a global economy that stretched from the North Atlantic to the Persian Gulf, and women occupied a specific, terrifying niche within that economy. Their value was reproductive. A man could work a field or row an oar, but a woman could do that and also produce children. Enslaved women were not just laborers. They were lineages repurposed, wombs that could create new generations of dependents, new slaves, or even new dynasties. In Iceland, the statistics prove it. Norse men plus Gaelic women equaled a nation. It was not accident. It was strategy. That strategy was brutally efficient. Violence stripped away status, name, kinship. Captivity turned people into property. Markets converted property into silver, and silver bought more violence. A cycle, self-sustaining, feeding itself year after year. The raids we picture as chaotic bursts of savagery were, in fact, investments. Raids produced captives. Captives produced profit. Profit produced power. This is why the stories of women recur again and again in the sources. Because without them, the Viking Age economy collapses. Without Howth's captives, Dublin does not thrive. Without Melkorka, Iceland's genealogies look different. Without the Queen of Strathclyde reduced to a line item, the annals do not speak of a great booty in people. Without Oseberg's foreigner, the grandeur of the ship burial loses half its meaning, and yet, these women are mostly voiceless in the records. The monks tally numbers, the sagas admire the men, the chronicles focus on kings and battles. The women are anonymized, reduced to a great number, or a captive, or simply omitted. Their individuality was stripped in life and erased in history. Only rarely does a name pierce the fog. Melkorka in Iceland, Ebba at Coldingham, Abbess Leofrun at Canterbury. Even then, their stories come to us warped, mediated by monks, merchants, or enemies, but archaeology and science have begun to restore what was erased. DNA analysis uncovers hidden ancestries. Isotopes trace lives from Persia to Norway. Grave goods whisper of forced sacrifices. Numbers in genetic surveys reveal what chronicles concealed: that the foundation of new nations was female, and that those females were overwhelmingly foreign, unwilling, abducted. The myth of the Viking Age is one of freedom, of adventure, of fearless exploration. But when you examine the ledger carefully, freedom was purchased with captivity. Adventure was funded by slavery. Exploration was powered not just by sails and oars, but by the lives of women dragged onto ships against their will. This is the economy of flesh. It explains why monasteries were burned, why fortresses were besieged, why kingdoms collapsed. Not because Vikings wanted only treasure, but because they wanted people. Women most of all. Look back at the 7 fates. Each one is a different angle of the same machine. At Howth, a ledger entry reduces women to a statistic. At Iceland, DNA reduces them to percentages. At Oseberg, archaeology reduces one to an accessory in death. Each story is partial. Together, they form the full picture. A society that weaponized women's bodies as currency, as lineage, as ornament, as tools of domination. And the echoes still remain. Icelanders today carry the mitochondrial DNA of women stolen more than 1,000 years ago. The soil at Coldingham still holds the ashes of nuns who chose fire over violation. The carvings of Oseberg still curl in wood, memorializing not just power but possession. The sagas will tell you about kings and raiders, about glory and exploration. But if you listen closely beneath the sagas, you will hear a quieter chorus. The women who were plundered, transported, silenced. They were the economy. They were the strategy. They were the foundation. We have walked through 7 fates: a monk's cold ledger at Howth, a mute princess in Iceland, a convent set aflame at Coldingham, a city betrayed at Canterbury, a fortress starved at Dumbarton, a nation founded on abduction in Iceland, a foreign woman sacrificed at Oseberg, each one a fragment. Together, a map of a world where women's bodies were strategy, currency, and collateral. The Viking Age shines bright in our imagination, dragon-proud ships cutting across gray seas, raiders with axes raised, sagas sung in smoky halls. But behind that brightness lies shadow. The sagas edited the picture. They showed us the bonfire, the laughter, the gold. They did not show us the silence that followed, the women crammed into holds, the genealogies rewritten by force. That silence is not absence. It is erasure. And erasure is itself a kind of violence. But history has ways of speaking even when chronicles fall silent. Archaeology digs up bones that whisper of journeys across continents. DNA reveals the hidden mothers of nations. Monastic records, though terse, leave clues. A single name, a single statistic, a line in the annals of Ulster, each a pinprick of light in the dark. When we stitch them together, a pattern emerges. And that pattern is not of isolated cruelty. It is of structure. It is of system. This is why we must resist the temptation to soften the story, to imagine captured women finding romance with noble raiders, to tell ourselves it was all adventure, All freedom, all glory. Those are modern fantasies that blunt the edge of history. The truth was pragmatic, calculated, and cold. These women were not rescued. They were reclassified. They were stripped of name, of kinship, of choice. They were thralls. And thrallship was not a footnote to Viking war. It was its engine. Think of Ebba the Younger and her nuns. They stood before the oncoming fire and chose to deface themselves, to cut away beauty, to take control of the only thing left to them, their own bodies. Think of Melkorka, silent for years, her refusal to speak a rebellion no man could break. Think of the nameless women of Dumbarton, thirsting behind walls, then herded into ships to be sold. Their choices were terrible. Their fates often ended in silence. But in that silence, there was defiance. That is why the final words of this story cannot be only about captivity. They must also be about resistance. Not resistance in the sense of armies or victories. Those stories are lost. But resistance in survival, in silence withheld, in lineage carried, in memory smuggled across generations, down mitochondrial DNA, across centuries, until it is uncovered by science and given voice again. When we look at Iceland today, we see a modern nation. But in its genes, we can still hear the Gaelic women who were taken there. They did not return home, but they did not vanish. Their bloodlines endured. Their mitochondrial DNA testifies we were here. When we look at the Oseberg burial, we see treasure. But in the second skeleton, we see a woman taken from the Black Sea, transported thousands of miles, sacrificed to decorate a queen's tomb. Her bones still lie there, speaking a truth the grave goods never intended to reveal. Burned, buried, silenced, and yet unbroken. Because to tell their stories now is to undo some of that erasure. To read the terse line, they carried off a great number of women, and to refuse to let it stand as only numbers. To take Melkorka's silence and hear not muteness but rebellion. To look at Iceland's DNA and name the women whose voices sagas erased. To stand before the Oseberg ship and recognize not just a queen's glory, but another woman's captivity. The Viking Age is not diminished by this truth. It is clarified. It is stripped of romantic gloss and revealed in full complexity. Daring explorers, yes, but also traffickers. Builders of nations, yes, but on stolen foundations. To remember only the ships and the sagas is to remember half a story. To remember the women is to tell the whole. And so, as the firelight fades, as the bonfire dies down on that imagined foreign shore, we must look not only at the victors laughing, horns raised. We must also look at the shadows cast behind them. In those shadows are the women whose lives paid for that fire, whose silence undergirded those sagas. They were carried, sold, scarred, erased. But they were also the thread that bound lineages, the wombs that carried nations, the voices that, when uncovered, remind us that history is not only what was written, but what was endured. Their bones lie in Irish soil, in Icelandic fields, in Norwegian graves. Their DNA hums in living people today. Their silence echoes still, burned, buried, forgotten, but unbroken.